Stop right there. The words cut through the quiet like a blade, sharp and immediate, the kind of command that doesn't ask for permission but demands obedience. And in that single moment, everything on that corner seemed to freeze. The hum of passing cars, the low buzz of the neon sign flickering above the small convenience store, even the soft shuffle of sneakers against the sidewalk, all of it fading into a tense, invisible pause as Officer Daniel Hayes stepped forward with the authority of someone who had never been questioned, his hand already resting near his belt, his posture rigid, his eyes locked onto one man standing alone just outside the store entrance. Marcus Reed didn't move, not because he was afraid, but because he had learned long ago that sometimes stillness speaks louder than anything else. He stood there in a worn brown jacket, hands relaxed at his sides, the faint glow of the streetlight catching the edges of his face, revealing lines carved not by age alone, but by years of experience that most people around him could never understand. And yet in that moment none of that mattered, because to Hayes, Marcus was not a story, not a man, not a life shaped by sacrifice. He was simply a presence that didn't belong. "What are you doing here?" Hayes asked, his tone already edged with suspicion, not curiosity, not concern, just assumption, the kind that forms before a single answer is given. And Marcus exhaled slowly, the air visible in the cool evening, his voice calm, steady, almost quiet enough to disappear if you weren't listening closely. "Waiting on a friend," he said, simple, direct, nothing more. But the simplicity didn't land, it never did. Because sometimes the truth isn't what people are looking for. Hayes took another step. Closer, his shadow stretching across the concrete, closing the distance in a way that felt less like conversation and more like control. "You been hanging around here long?" He pressed, eyes narrowing, scanning Marcus from head to toe as if the answer might be written somewhere on his clothes, on his skin, on something deeper that only he believed he could see. And across the street, a couple of bystanders slowed their pace, their attention drawn not by noise but by tension, that quiet kind of tension that builds before something shifts, before something breaks. Marcus nodded. Slightly, not defensive, not confrontational, just present. "Couple minutes," he replied, and for a brief second, there was silence, the kind that stretches thin, like a wire pulled too tight. And then Hayes made his decision, not based on evidence, not on action, but on something unspoken, something heavier than logic. "Turn around," he said, the words firm, final. And for a moment, you could feel it, that invisible line being crossed, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Marcus hesitated, not out of defiance, but out of something deeper, something quieter, something that asked a question without speaking it. Imagine standing there, doing nothing wrong, saying nothing wrong, and still feeling the weight of someone else's judgment pressing down on you, shaping the moment before you even have a chance to exist inside it. Marcus slowly turned, his movements controlled, deliberate, his hands moving just enough to show he wasn't resisting, just enough to maintain his dignity, because dignity was something no one had ever given him. It was something he carried, something he held on to even when the world around him tried to strip it away piece by piece. Hayes reached for the cuffs, the metallic click echoing louder than it should have in the stillness of the street. And just like that, the narrative had been decided. A man standing outside a corner store had become a suspect. A situation had become a spectacle, and across the sidewalk, phones began to rise. Subtle at first, then more obvious. People watching, recording, whispering, not because they understood, but because something about the moment felt wrong. Even if they couldn't explain why, Marcus didn't resist. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice, and that silence, that composure, only seemed to fuel something inside Hayes, because sometimes power expects reaction, it feeds on it, and when it doesn't get it, it pushes harder. "You fit a description," Hayes said, almost as if the words justified everything that had already happened, as if they could erase the weight of assumption that came before them. Marcus looked ahead, not at Hayes, not at the crowd, just forward, his voice low, steady, carrying a calm that felt out of place in a moment like this. "Of what?" he asked. And there it was, a simple question, but one that hung in the air longer than expected, because the truth is, sometimes there isn't an answer that can hold up under light. Sometimes there's only silence. And that silence says more than anything else ever could. The neon sign flickered again, casting brief flashes of light across the scene, illuminating details that no one was paying attention to yet. The faint outline of something tucked inside Marcus's jacket, the subtle weight of a past no one here had bothered to ask about, the kind of past that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand recognition, but exists all the same, steady, unshaken, waiting, because the thing about truth is, it doesn't need to rush, it doesn't need to fight to be seen. It simply waits for the moment when everything else falls apart around it. And on that quiet corner, under that flickering light, with a man in handcuffs and a crowd holding its breath, that moment was already beginning to take shape, even if no one realized it yet. The sound of distant traffic rolled back in slowly, like the world remembering how to move again after holding its breath. But the energy on that corner had changed. It was heavier now, thicker, as if something unseen had settled into the air and refused to leave. Officer Daniel Hayes tightened his grip slightly on Marcus Reed's arm, not enough to cause a scene, but enough to remind everyone watching who was in control. And that was the point, control, not clarity, not truth, just control. The kind that does not ask questions because it believes it already has the answers. And Marcus stood there, shoulders steady, gaze forward, not meeting the officer's eyes, not giving the moment more than it deserved, because somewhere deep inside, he understood something most people did not, that reacting would only feed what was already unfolding. You carrying anything I should know about? Hayes asked, his voice low but firm, scanning Marcus again as if searching for confirmation of something he had already decided. And Marcus shook his head slightly. No, sir, he replied, calm, respectful, measured, the kind of tone that had been shaped over years, not just by discipline, but by survival. And still, it was not enough, because sometimes nothing is enough when the outcome has already been chosen. Across the street, a man in a baseball cap leaned against a parked truck, arms folded, watching with a frown he did not quite realize he was making, while a young woman near the store entrance held her phone just low enough to pretend she was not recording, her eyes flicking between Marcus and the officer, sensing something that did not sit right, even if she could not explain it. And Hayes began his routine, asking questions that did not lead anywhere, repeating instructions that had already been followed, creating movement where none was needed, because movement creates justification, and justification makes everything feel official. Step forward, he said, then, stay still, contradicting himself without noticing, because the goal was not clarity, it was dominance, and Marcus complied each time, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, every motion controlled, every breath even, as if he had been here before, not this exact place, not this exact moment, but this feeling, this weight, this quiet test of patience and restraint. And for a brief second, as the streetlight flickered again, his eyes shifted, not toward the officer, not toward the crowd, but somewhere inward, somewhere distant. And if you looked closely, you might have seen it, not fear, not anger, but memory, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that slips in quietly, uninvited, a different night, a different kind of tension, where the air had felt just as thick, just as heavy, but for reasons no one here could understand. The echo of commands that sounded similar but carried a different meaning, the weight of responsibility instead of assumption, the kind of moments where decisions mattered in ways that stretched far beyond a single street corner. And then just as quickly, he was back, standing under that flickering light, hands restrained, surrounded by strangers who were beginning to whisper more openly now, their voices low but growing. He does not look like he is doing anything wrong, someone murmured, and another replied. Then why is he in cuffs? And that question lingered, moving from person to person, unanswered, uncomfortable, because once it is asked, it becomes harder to ignore. Hayes shifted his stance, his jaw tightening slightly, aware now of the attention, aware of the eyes, but instead of stepping back, he leaned further in, doubling down on the moment, because stepping back would mean questioning himself, and that was not something he was used to doing. We have had reports of suspicious activity in this area, he said louder this time, not just to Marcus, but to the crowd, to anyone listening, as if the volume of his voice could reinforce the legitimacy of his actions. And for a moment, some people nodded, not because they believed it fully, but because authority has a way of shaping perception, of making doubt feel like defiance. And Marcus finally turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at Hayes, his expression unchanged, his voice still calm, but carrying something deeper now, something grounded, standing outside Astorius. Suspicious? He asked, and it was not sarcasm, not confrontation, just a question, simple, clear, undeniable, and it hung there, heavier than anything else that had been said, because sometimes the simplest questions are the hardest to answer. Hayes opened his mouth slightly, then paused, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for the crowd to feel it, enough for the moment to shift ever so slightly. And in that shift, in that brief crack in certainty, something else began to surface, something that had been there all along, unnoticed, tucked away beneath layers of assumption, waiting, patient, steady, like a truth that does not need to rush because it knows its time is coming. And under the edge of Marcus's jacket, just barely visible as the fabric moved with his breath, there was the faint outline of something worn, something carried not for show but for meaning, something that told a story no one here had asked to hear, at least not yet. For a moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because something in the air had shifted just enough to make people unsure of what came next, the kind of hesitation that only appears when certainty begins to crack. And Officer Daniel Hayes felt it even if he could not name it, the subtle change in the crowd, the way their whispers had grown less passive and more questioning, the way their eyes no longer followed his authority automatically, but instead lingered on Marcus. Read, searching, trying to understand what did not quite add up, and Hayes adjusted his stance again, squaring his shoulders as if posture alone could restore control. "You can explain it downtown," he said, his tone sharper now, less patient, more defensive, because when authority feels challenged, even slightly, it often responds by tightening its grip rather than loosening it. And Marcus remained still, his breathing steady, his gaze calm, but there was something different now, not in his posture, not in his voice, but in the silence he carried, a silence that no longer felt passive but deliberate, as if he was allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to. "Officer," Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension without raising itself. "What exactly am I being detained for?" And there it was again, another simple question, another moment where clarity was requested instead of assumed, and for a brief second, Hayes hesitated, not long, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for that same crack to widen just a little more, because the truth is, questions like that do not just ask for answers, they demand accountability. And accountability is something power does not always welcome. "Suspicious behavior," Hayes replied, the words coming out quickly this time, as if speed could compensate for substance, and Marcus nodded slightly, not agreeing, not conceding, just acknowledging. And then he spoke again, just as calm, just as steady. "Standing still is suspicious behavior now." And the crowd reacted this time, not loudly, not dramatically, but audibly, a few murmurs of agreement, a quiet shift in tone that was impossible to ignore, because once doubt begins to spread, it does not stay contained, it moves, it grows, it settles into places where certainty once lived, and Hayes could feel it pressing in from all sides. The eyes, the phones, the presence of people who were no longer just watching but thinking, questioning, and that made the moment more dangerous than any raised voice ever could, because noise can be dismissed, but quiet doubt lingers. And just as Hayes opened his mouth to respond, to reassert, to regain control of a situation that was beginning to slip in ways he did not expect, a voice came from behind the crowd, steady, older, carrying a weight that made people instinctively turn. "Marcus." The name cut through the scene in a way nothing else had. Not loud, not aggressive, but certain, and Marcus's eyes shifted for the first time fully away from Hayes, turning toward the sound, and for a brief moment, something changed in his expression, not relief, not fear, but recognition, a connection to something beyond this corner, beyond this moment. A tall man stepped forward from the edge of the sidewalk, his pace measured, his presence calm but undeniable, wearing a faded jacket with a small embroidered patch near the shoulder, the kind of detail most people would overlook unless they knew what it meant. And as he approached, his gaze moved from Marcus to Hayes, assessing, not reacting. "Is there a problem here, officer?" the man asked, his tone respectful but firm. The kind of tone that does not escalate but does not retreat either. And Hayes turned toward him, irritation flickering across his face. "Sir, this does not concern you," he replied quickly, but the man did not step back, did not look away. Instead, his eyes returned briefly to Marcus, taking in the cuffs, the situation, the quiet tension that had built around them, and then back to Hayes. "It concerns me if you are detaining him without cause," he said, and the words landed differently this time, because they were not coming from the crowd, not from uncertainty, but from someone who spoke with a kind of calm authority that did not need a badge to be felt. And Hayes hesitated again, just slightly, just enough, because something about this man, something about the way he stood, the way he spoke, suggested that this was no longer as simple as it had seemed a few minutes ago. And in that moment, as the streetlight flickered once more, the outline beneath Marcus's jacket shifted just enough to catch the light. A small glint, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but there, waiting, as if the truth itself was beginning to lean forward, ready to be seen. The man's presence did not arrive with noise, it arrived with weight, the kind that settles into a space without asking permission. And as he stepped closer, the subtle murmur of the crowd shifted again, not louder, but sharper, more focused, because something about him suggested that this moment was no longer just a routine stop, no longer just another scene that would pass and be forgotten. And Officer Daniel Hayes felt it, even if he tried not to show it. The way his posture stiffened, the way his eyes flickered briefly toward the embroidered patch on the man's jacket before returning to Marcus Reed, as if trying to anchor himself back to control. "I said this does not concern you," Hayes repeated, his tone firmer now, but there was a thin edge beneath it, something less certain than before, and the man did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply took another step forward, closing the distance just enough to stand beside Marcus. Not in front of him, not behind him, but beside him, equal, steady, and he looked at the cuffs, then at Marcus's face, then back at Hayes. "Then explain it," he said, calm, direct. The kind of request that does not escalate, but does not disappear either. And for a moment, Hayes hesitated again, because the situation had begun to slip into unfamiliar territory, the kind where authority alone no longer controlled the narrative, where questions started to matter more than commands, and the crowd leaned in slightly, not physically, but emotionally, their attention narrowing, their silence deepening, because something was building, something they could feel even if they could not yet name it. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, not resisting, not pulling away, just adjusting, and as he did, the edge of his jacket moved again, just enough for the man beside him to notice, his eyes dropping for a fraction of a second before lifting again. And when they did, something had changed, not in intensity, not in volume, but in recognition. "Marcus," he said again, quieter this time, almost under his breath, and Marcus gave the slightest nod, a confirmation without words, a connection that did not need explanation. And Hayes caught it, that exchange, that subtle shift, and it unsettled him. More than the crowd, more than the questions, because it suggested there was something here he did not understand, something outside his control. "Do you know this individual?" Hayes asked quickly, redirecting, trying to regain footing, and the man turned his gaze back to him, steady, unshaken. "Yes," he said simply. "I do." And that was all. No elaboration, no defense, just a statement. But sometimes a single word carries more weight than a full explanation, especially when it is delivered without hesitation, and the air tightened again, not with tension, but with anticipation, because the moment was stretching, pulling towards something just out of reach. And Hayes shifted his stance once more, his grip loosening slightly without him realizing it, his mind trying to recalibrate, to find solid ground in a situation that was beginning to feel less predictable by the second. "He matched a report," Hayes said, his voice louder now, projecting again, not just to the man, but to the crowd, to anyone listening, as if repeating the justification could make it stronger. But the man beside Marcus did not react to the volume, did not flinch, did not step back. Instead, he glanced once more at Marcus, then back at Hayes, and asked, "What report?" And the question landed with precision, not aggressive, not accusatory, just exact. And Hayes paused, just for a second, But it was enough, enough for the silence to grow heavier, enough for the crowd to feel the shift more clearly now, because when a question like that is asked, it does not just seek an answer, it exposes the absence of one. And Hayes's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly as he searched for words that would hold, for something that would restore the balance he felt slipping away. But before he could respond, the man reached slowly toward Marcus's jacket, not abruptly, not forcefully, just a small, deliberate motion, and Marcus did not resist, did not move. He simply allowed it, because some truths do not need protection, they only need to be revealed. And as the fabric shifted back just enough, the light caught it again, clearer this time, not just a glint, but a shape, a metal, worn, not polished for display, but carried, and the man's eyes settled on it for a brief second before lifting once more, and when he spoke again, his voice was the same calm tone, but now it carried something else, something undeniable. "Officer," he said, "do you know who you are detaining?" And the question did not echo, it did not need to, because in that moment, it was already louder than anything else that had been said. The question did not just hang in the air, it settled into it, heavy and immovable, the kind of question that forces everything around it to slow down, to reconsider, to look again. And for the first time since the moment began, Officer Daniel Hayes did not answer immediately, his mouth parted slightly, his eyes shifting not toward the crowd, not toward the man beside Marcus Reed, but toward the small object now partially revealed beneath the edge of that worn jacket. And in that fraction of a second, something changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because recognition does not always arrive as a clear understanding. Sometimes it begins as discomfort, as a quiet realization that what you thought you knew no longer fits the reality in front of you. And Hayes took a small step back without meaning to, his grip loosening just enough to be noticed, just enough for the crowd to feel the shift ripple outward, subtle but real. The young woman with the phone lowered it slightly, her eyes narrowing as she leaned forward just a little, trying to see what had caught the officer's attention. While the man in the baseball cap straightened from the truck, his arms unfolding as if instinctively preparing for something more than observation. And Marcus remained still, as he had been from the beginning, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady, his presence grounded in a way that seemed to contrast everything else happening around him. And that contrast was beginning to speak louder than any words. Because while the situation had been built on assumption, Marcus stood there as if anchored in something far deeper, something that did not need validation from the moment, something that existed long before this corner, this streetlight, this officer, and the man beside him did not rush, did not push. He simply reached a little further, just enough to fully reveal what had already begun to surface, the fabric shifting back to expose the metal resting against Marcus's chest, worn but unmistakable, its edges catching the light with a quiet dignity that did not demand attention, but commanded it all the same. And for a moment, everything stopped again, not because of a command, not because of authority, but because of meaning, because even in a crowd that may not have understood every detail, there was something universally recognized in that symbol, something tied to sacrifice, to service, to a story larger than the assumptions that had led to this moment. And Hayes saw it now, clearly, fully, the small piece of metal that carried a weight far beyond its size, and his expression shifted, just slightly, the rigid certainty softening into something less defined, less confident. "What is that?" someone in the crowd whispered, not loudly, but enough for others to lean in, enough for the question to spread, and the man beside Marcus did not look at them, did not address the crowd. His focus remained on Hayes, because this moment was not about spectacle, it was about truth. "That," he said calmly, nodding toward the metal, "is not something you earn by standing on a street corner." And the words were not sharp, not accusatory, but they carried a weight that landed deeper than any raised voice could have. And Hayes swallowed slightly, his gaze fixed now on the metal, as if trying to process it, to fit it into the narrative he had constructed just minutes ago. But it did not fit, it could not fit, because the narrative had been built without it, without context, without question, and now that context was standing right in front of him, undeniable, unmovable, and the crowd felt it, the shift from curiosity to realization, the quiet understanding that something had been wrong from the beginning, that the man in cuffs was not who they had been led to believe, and Marcus finally spoke again, his voice calm, steady, but now carrying a depth that had not been fully heard before. "I have been standing on corners like this for a long time," he said, not as a defense, not as a justification, but as a statement, a truth that existed beyond this moment. Only difference is, most of them were not here, and he paused, just for a second, the weight of his words settling in, before adding quietly. "And most of them did not come with questions like this." And Hayes looked at him then, really looked, for the first time since the encounter began, not scanning, not judging, but seeing, and what he saw did not match what he had assumed, could not match, because assumption had no place in the presence of truth, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of realization, of discomfort, of something that could not be undone but had to be faced, and the man beside Marcus took a small step back, not retreating, but allowing the moment to stand on its own, because the reveal had already happened, the truth was already there, and now it was up to Hayes, not the crowd, not Marcus, not anyone else, to decide what came next, because sometimes the most powerful moment is not the exposure of truth, but what someone chooses to do once they can no longer ignore it. The silence that followed was not the kind that fades away, it was the kind that settles deeper, pressing against every person standing there, forcing them to sit with what they had just witnessed, and Officer Daniel Hayes stood in the center of it, his hand no longer firm, no longer certain, the weight of the moment now resting squarely on his shoulders, because the narrative he had built only minutes ago had begun to collapse in front of him, piece by piece, without noise, without confrontation, just truth quietly taking its place. And he looked at the metal. Again, really looked this time, not as an object, but as a symbol, something that carried meaning far beyond his assumptions, something that did not align with the image he had forced on a Marcus Reed. And for a brief second, you could see it, the internal shift, the hesitation that comes when certainty gives way to doubt, when control begins to feel less like authority and more like exposure, and the crowd felt it too. Their whispers no longer uncertain, but grounded now in a shared understanding that something had gone wrong, that the situation they were watching was not what it had first appeared to be, and Marcus remained still, his posture unchanged, but there was a quiet strength in that stillness, something that did not push, did not demand, but stood firm in its own truth, and that kind of presence does not need to speak loudly to be heard. It simply exists until everything around it is forced to acknowledge it. Hayes cleared his throat slightly, a small, almost involuntary motion, as if trying to reset the moment, to regain some version of control. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked, his voice lower now, less sharp, less certain, and the question hung there, revealing more about him than it did about Marcus, because it assumed that the responsibility to correct the situation had belonged to the one being detained, and Marcus turned his head slightly, meeting Hayes's eyes for the first time fully, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that felt heavier than either. "I did," Marcus said quietly. "You just were not listening." And the words landed with a clarity that cut through everything else, not aggressive, not raised, but undeniable, and Hayes blinked, the simplicity of the statement leaving no room for deflection, because sometimes the truth does not need to be complex to be powerful. Sometimes it is the simplest observations that expose the deepest flaws, and the man beside Marcus exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement, as if he had seen this before, as if this moment was not new, just another version of something that repeated itself more often than it should, and he stepped back another inch, giving space, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because now it was no longer about revealing the truth, it was about what came after. And Hayes shifted again, his posture no longer rigid but uncertain, his eyes moving briefly to the crowd, then back to Marcus, aware now of the attention in a different way, not as validation, but as witness, because the same eyes that had once assumed were now watching, evaluating, holding the moment in a way that could not be undone, and for a second, his hand hovered near the cuffs, not acting, not yet, but considering, because that is the moment where everything changes, not when truth is revealed, but when someone decides what to do with it. And the streetlight flickered once more, casting a soft, uneven glow across the scene, illuminating faces that had shifted from curiosity to reflection, from passive observation to quiet understanding. And Marcus stood there, not asking, not demanding, simply present, his dignity intact, his silence now louder than any argument could have been. And Hayes finally took a breath, deeper than before, as if grounding himself in a reality that had shifted beneath his feet. And when he spoke again, his voice was different, not authoritative, not commanding, but measured, searching for footing in a moment where certainty had been replaced by accountability. "I am going to need to verify this," he said. And it was not a command. It was not even a defense. It was an attempt. An attempt to move forward in a way that acknowledged what had been revealed without fully confronting what had led to it. And Marcus gave a small nod. Not in agreement, not in submission, but in understanding, because he knew something Hayes was only beginning to realize. That verification was not about the metal. It was about the moment, about what had been assumed, about what had been done before any questions were asked. And as Hayes reached for his radio, his movements slower now, more deliberate, the weight of the situation settling into each action. The crowd remained silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because they understood that this was no longer just a scene. It was a lesson unfolding in real time, one that did not need commentary, only attention. And under that flickering light, on that quiet corner, the balance had shifted completely, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more powerful, the simple, undeniable presence of truth. The faint crackle of the radio broke the silence, a low static hum that seemed louder than it should have been in a moment already filled with tension, and Officer Daniel Hayes lifted it slowly, his movements no longer sharp or automatic, but measured, as if each action now carried weight he could not ignore. "Dispatch. I need a verification," he said, his voice steady but lacking the earlier edge. And even that subtle change did not go unnoticed, because tone reveals what words try to conceal. And the crowd felt it, the shift from command to caution, from certainty to hesitation, and Marcus Reed stood as he had from the beginning, unmoved, unshaken, his presence grounded in something far deeper than the situation unfolding around him, while the man beside him watched quietly, his eyes moving between Hayes and Marcus, not intervening, not pushing, simply witnessing, because this moment no longer needed force. It needed truth to finish what it had already begun. The radio crackled. Again, a voice responding, routine, detached, unaware of the weight carried in the request, and Hayes spoke Marcus's name, slower this time, careful, as if saying it correctly now mattered in a way it had not before. And as he gave the details, the crowd leaned in just slightly, their attention tightening, their curiosity now anchored in something more than spectacle, because they were no longer watching a situation unfold. They were watching a realization take shape, and that is far harder to look away from. Seconds stretched, longer than they should have, because waiting changes the rhythm of a moment. It forces reflection. It allows doubt to grow. And Hayes lowered the radio slightly, his eyes drifting once more to the metal, then to Marcus's face. And there was something different there now, something he had not allowed himself to see before, not just a man, but a presence, a history, a story that existed long before this street corner. And for the first time, Hayes looked uncertain not about the situation, but about himself, about the choices he had made in the seconds before any of this had been revealed. And the radio answered, the voice clearer this time, sharper, carrying information that did not hesitate, did not question, simply confirmed. And Hayes's expression shifted again, more noticeably now, the last fragments of certainty falling away as the truth was spoken back to him, through static and protocol. And he did not respond immediately, his grip on the radio loosening as he absorbed it, as if the confirmation had not just verified Marcus's identity, but had quietly dismantled everything Hayes had assumed about him, about the moment, about his own role in it. And the crowd felt it without hearing the words, because sometimes you do not need to hear the truth to recognize its impact. You only need to see how someone reacts to it. And Hayes took a slow breath, deeper than before, his shoulders lowering just slightly, the tension in his stance giving way to something else, something less rigid, less certain, more human. And his hand moved again, this time not hovering, not hesitating, but acting, reaching toward the cuffs with a motion that was no longer about control, but about correction, and the small metallic click that followed was softer than before, almost swallowed by the silence that surrounded it. But it carried more weight than anything that had come earlier, because this time, it was not about restraint, it was about release, and Marcus did not pull away quickly, did not react with urgency. He simply let his arms lower naturally, as if returning to a state that had never truly left him. Because dignity does not disappear when it is challenged, it waits, it endures, and the man beside him gave a small nod, not triumphant, not relieved, just acknowledging what had been restored, and Hayes stepped back, just one step, but enough to change the entire space between them, enough to remove the pressure that had defined the moment from the start. And he looked at Marcus again, not scanning, not judging, but seeing, fully now, the person he had failed to recognize before. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of the authority it had once carried, replaced with something far more difficult to hold on to. "Sir," he began, the word landing differently than it would have minutes ago, because respect given after recognition carries a different weight than respect assumed from the beginning. And he paused, just briefly, as if choosing his next words carefully, aware now that they mattered in a way they had not before. "You are free to go." And the sentence was simple, standard, something said countless times in countless situations, but here, in this moment, it carried something else, something unspoken, something that lingered beneath the surface. Because freedom had never really been the question. It had been recognition. It had been dignity. It had been the difference between being seen and being assumed. And as Marcus adjusted his jacket, the metal once again resting beneath the fabric, no longer exposed but no less present, he did not rush, did not leave immediately. He simply stood there for a second longer, looking at Hayes with the same calm expression, and in that quiet pause, there was no anger, no triumph, just a steady, grounded presence that said more than any words could have. Because sometimes the most powerful response is not what you say, but what you choose not to say. And the streetlight flickered again above them, casting a soft glow over a moment that had shifted completely, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more lasting, the quiet, undeniable weight of truth finally being acknowledged. For a few seconds after the words were spoken, no one moved, not because they were unsure of what had just happened, but because they were absorbing what it meant, the kind of moment that does not end when the action stops, but lingers, stretching out into something deeper, something that settles into memory. And Marcus Reed stood there with his arms free, the weight of the cuffs gone, but the weight of the moment still present, not on him, but around him. And Officer Daniel Hayes remained where he was, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by command, but by something quieter, something harder to carry, awareness, the realization that the situation he had created could not simply be undone by a single sentence. Because while release corrects the action, it does not erase the assumption that led to it. And the crowd felt that too, their silence no longer tense, but reflective, as if each person standing there was reconsidering what they had seen, what they had believed in those first moments, and how quickly perception can shift when truth steps into the light. The young woman lowered her phone completely now, no longer recording, her expression thoughtful, unsettled in a way that suggested this moment would stay with her longer than she expected, while the man by the truck shook his head slightly, not in anger, but in quiet disbelief, as if trying to reconcile how something so simple had become something so revealing. And Marcus adjusted the sleeve of his jacket, a small, almost routine motion, but it carried a sense of closure, a return to himself, to the quiet dignity he had never lost, even when it had been challenged. And the man beside him gave a slight nod again, this time accompanied by a faint exhale, the kind that comes not from relief, but from recognition. Recognition that what had just happened was not new, not rare, but part of something larger, something that repeats until it is seen clearly enough to be questioned. And Hayes finally spoke again, his voice lower now, stripped of the confidence it had once carried. "I should not have assumed," he said, the words simple, but difficult, because acknowledgement requires more than awareness. It requires ownership, and ownership is not something easily given in moments like this. And Marcus looked at him, not with judgment, not with approval, but with a steady gaze that held no need for validation, because he understood something Hayes was only beginning to learn, that the impact of a moment is not measured by the apology that follows, but by the understanding that grows from it. "It is not about me," Marcus said quietly, his voice even, grounded. "It is about what you see when you look at someone before you know anything about them." And the words landed with a clarity that extended beyond the two of them, reaching into the space around them, into the crowd, into the moment itself, because this was no longer just an interaction. It had become a reflection, a mirror held up to something deeper, something that does not always reveal itself so clearly. And Hayes lowered his gaze slightly, not out of shame alone, but out of thought, the kind that forces you to reconsider what you believed without ever questioning it. And for a brief second, the street felt quieter than before, not because the world had stopped, but because attention had shifted inward, each person processing what they had witnessed, and Marcus took a small step back, not retreating, but reclaiming his space, the same space he had occupied from the beginning. Only now it felt different, not because he had changed, but because the perception around him had. And that difference was everything, because perception shapes reality in ways that actions alone cannot undo. And the man beside him placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, not to guide, not to lead, but to acknowledge. And Marcus gave a slight nod in return, a silent understanding passing between them, one that did not need explanation. And Hayes remained still, watching, not as an officer now, but as a man confronting the weight of a moment that had revealed more than he expected. And as Marcus turned slightly, preparing to leave, there was no rush, no urgency, just a quiet, deliberate movement forward, the kind that carries its own sense of resolution. And the crowd parted subtly, not out of instruction, but out of instinct, making space not just for him to pass, but for the moment itself to settle, to conclude in a way that did not require noise or spectacle. And as he walked past them, his jacket shifting naturally with each step, the metal remained hidden once more, not because it needed to be concealed, but because it had already done what it needed to do. It had revealed a truth that did not belong to it alone, but to the moment, to the lesson, to the quiet realization that sometimes the greatest weight is not carried in what is seen, but in what is understood too late. And behind him, under that same flickering streetlight, Officer Daniel Hayes stood in silence, not because there was nothing left to say, but because for the first time, he was beginning to listen. The night did not return to normal right away. Even as Marcus Reed's footsteps moved steadily down the sidewalk, even as the low hum of traffic resumed, and the flickering streetlight continued its quiet rhythm above the corner store, something had shifted in a way that could not simply fade, because moments like that do not disappear when they end. They stay. They echo. They settle into the people who witnessed them. And behind him, Officer Daniel Hayes remained standing in the same spot, not out of duty, not out of procedure, but because leaving would have been easier than staying. And for the first time that evening, he did not choose the easier path. He chose to stand in it, to feel the weight of what had just happened, not as an officer, but as a man confronted with the consequences of a moment he had created without fully understanding it. The crowd began to thin slowly, not all at once, but in small movements, people turning away, returning to their routines, but with quieter expressions, with glances that lingered a little longer than before, as if each of them carried a piece of what they had just seen. The young woman slipped her phone into her pocket, her steps slower now, her thoughts clearly somewhere else, while the man by the truck shook his head once more before climbing in, pausing for a second behind the wheel as if replaying the scene in his mind, because what they had witnessed was not just an interaction, it was a reflection, a moment that forced a question most people do not ask until they have to. And Hayes finally moved, not forward, not toward anyone, but slightly to the side, his eyes still fixed in the direction Marcus had walked, as if trying to follow something he could not see anymore, something that had passed through that space and left behind more than silence. And he exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes when something settles deeper than expected, because the truth is, it was never about the metal, it was never about the verification, it was about the seconds before any of that mattered, the moment when he had made a decision based on nothing but assumption, and those seconds could not be undone, they could only be understood, and that understanding was heavier than anything he had carried on his belt, heavier than any authority he had relied on, because it required him to look at himself in a way he had never been forced to before, and across the street. The store owner stood quietly in the doorway, arms folded, watching the last of the scene dissolve, his expression unreadable, but his presence steady, as if he had seen enough of these moments to know how they begin and how they end, and how rarely they are truly understood. And further down the sidewalk, Marcus did not look back, not because he was unaware, but because he did not need to, his steps even, measured, grounded in a life that had already taught him what moments like that meant, what they revealed, what they demanded, and what they never fully resolved. And as he reached the edge of the block, the man who had stood beside him earlier walked a few steps ahead, turning slightly to match his pace. And for a moment, they walked in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already been understood. And Marcus adjusted his jacket once more, the metal resting quietly beneath it, unseen again, not hidden, just no longer needed in the same way, because its purpose had already been fulfilled, not to prove who he was, but to expose what had been assumed about him. And behind them, under that same streetlight, Hayes finally lowered his head just slightly, not in defeat, not in shame alone, but in reflection, the kind that does not end when the moment passes, but follows you, stays with you, challenges you in the quiet spaces where there are no crowds, no voices, no distractions, only the truth of what you did and the choice of what you will do next. And as the night settled back into its rhythm, as the sounds of the city filled the spaces that had been held by tension and silence, one thing remained, not visible, not spoken, but undeniable, the understanding that authority does not define justice, and assumption does not define truth. Because on that corner, under that flickering light, a man who thought he was enforcing the law had been confronted by something far greater, something quieter, something that did not need a badge to carry weight. And long after the scene had ended, long after the crowd had gone, long after Marcus had disappeared into the distance, that realization stayed, lingering in the air like an echo that refused to fade. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons are not the ones spoken out loud, but the ones you are forced to carry with you, the ones that remind you, over and over again, that the difference between power and justice is not found in what you wear, but in what you choose to see. And that night, for the first time, the law had looked at itself and realized it had something to learn.